Did you know that flop has been added to the classic trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn? Let's talk about that. Our trauma responses are the way that our body and mind keep us safe when we are not perceived as safe. But what is this new trauma response called flop? First, let's do a quick recap of what the existing trauma responses are. So, trauma responses occur when our brain is perceiving that there is a threat. Our nervous system, specifically our autonomic nervous system, takes over with a reflexive response, meaning that we cannot choose or control this response. This automatic response is carried out by the sympathetic branch of our nervous system. This is commonly referred to being in fight or flight mode. Depending on the situation and the person, this automatic response to threat can look like fighting back, running away, freezing in place, or fawning, which is people pleasing to appease or dismantle the perceived threat. But sometimes the nervous system activates a different kind of response flop. In the flop response, a person can physically collapse, go limp, or even appear completely non responsive. This might be confusing and even scary, but neuropsychologically, it is a survival mechanism. So, what does this flop response look like? Depending on the person and situation, it can look like collapsing to the floor. It can be going limp, our whole body going like jello, such as being shut down entirely. For others, it may be less obvious, such as a person feeling physically heavy, unable to move or speak, despite being conscious of what is happening around them. Flop is not always dramatic, though. It can sometimes show up in the form of dissociation. It can be feeling mentally checked out or detached from reality. You might notice yourself staring blankly, feeling emotionally numb or unresponsive to external stimuli. Internally, you may describe the feeling and experience as being disconnected from your body, as if you were watching things happen from a distance, or if something was driving you automatically, but you weren't part of the driving. But here's where it gets a little more interesting and important to understand. The flop response or any trauma response can be triggered not by a current threat, but a threat that happened in our past. When someone experiences trauma, the brain actually encodes the event in a way that causes it to replay it in similar situations that are experienced. For example, if the trauma occurred in a movie theater, perhaps the smell of movie popcorn, even years later, can bring a person right back to the trauma, triggering their trauma response. These are called trauma triggers. When something similar to the trauma in your current experience reminds your nervous system of the trauma itself. These triggers can be anything, such as a sound, a word, or even a thought. They remind the brain of the original danger so that you can respond and keep yourself safe. That's the function of it. When the brain recognizes the trigger, it can send the nervous system into overdrive, activating a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or now flop response, even when there is no real threat in the present moment. This is why trauma triggers, especially flop, can feel so confusing or even invalidating to the person experiencing it. It doesn't always make sense in the moment. From a neurobiological perspective, it's the body's way of saying, this feels overwhelming to handle, so I am just going to shut down to survive. The key takeaway here is that trauma responses are not you being too dramatic. It's not you overreacting or being too sensitive. They are a legitimate physical response to the body perceiving and the mind perceiving that you're not safe. Recognizing this can help us approach ourselves and others with more compassion and understanding. Now, let's talk about the brain a little bit. We have this tiny almond shaped structure in our brain that is called the amygdala. It is our brain's threat detection center. If the amygdala thinks there is overwhelming danger and the body perceives escape or resistance or safety as simply impossible, the parasympathetic nervous system is kicked into overdrive. The extreme activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, especially via the vagus nerve, which runs from our brain down through our body, is what triggers our flop response. This is very different from the other trauma responses that prepare our body for action via the sympathetic nervous system. That action is fight, flight. It's the body getting ready to expend energy. Whereas the flop response is the extreme activation of the parasympathetic nervous system that goes to shut the body down to keep it safe and conserve energy. This trauma response is also rooted in evolutionary psychology. Many animals, when they perceive a threat, go into a flop response. They want to use this strategy as a last ditch effort to survive predators. Think of a possum playing dead. This is essentially the flop response in action, dramatically, but in action. So, why is this important for us to understand? It is important for us to recognize that when a person responds in flop, it is a legitimate and valid trauma response that a person is not necessarily in control of. People who experience flop describe feeling disconnected, detached, or even paralyzed during high stress situations or when they experience trauma triggers, the memory of trauma. It's so crucial to validate these experiences. They are not signs of weakness or failure, but rather the body and mind, the nervous system, trying its best to keep us safe. From a neurological perspective, understanding the flop response can open up treatment pathways, treatments that potentially address calming the vagus nerve via deep breathing, mindfulness, somatic therapies. They can help an individual gain the feeling of control, that there is something they can do to actually address this and reduce the chances of it happening. If you've experienced flop in the past and flop wasn't recognized as a valid trauma response, I am so sorry that that happened to you. But now science has progressed to actually say flop is a valid trauma response. It doesn't mean that it wasn't less true before science got there, but we're here now and we are recognizing that flop can be scary, it can be unpredictable. Disassociation in general can feel like a complete loss of control, and there can be a feeling of hopelessness. But no, there is hope, and there are ways to treat the flop response. You are not alone. Thank you so much for listening and learning with me. If you're interested, feel free to subscribe or give this video a like if it really resonated or clicked with you. And I'm always curious about what you think. Let me know in the comments. What do you think of this newly recognized trauma response? It's always been a thing, but science finally is recognizing it. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in. Be kind to yourself and have a fantastic day.